Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to the audience for being here. I'm happy to present this research on behalf of myself and Anais Guillem, research that was carried out when we were fellows, respectively, of the Digital Society Initiative and the Swiss Art Research Infrastructure. And this research was funded for us to look at deepening the semantic modeling available for representing artistic information. Um, and so I'll just move you into that problem. It's obviously a big problem. We basically wanted to look at, how to gather more information around artistic works than simply the data that typically is recorded in collections management systems, but really gather the full range of information that's created by researchers around information systems, and really talks about the whole artistic object, and not just the object, but everything around it. And so that's a lot to chew up, to take on. And so we narrowed it down following up some research we had already begun previously on architecture. And so, which is also a big topic, but at least it narrows it down somewhat. So when you start thinking about representing information around architecture ontologically, you start to question, well, what is architecture? What is the object in question? And of course, a naive and a brute answer would be, well, it's buildings, it's artistic buildings. But obviously, if you push even slightly on that idea, you go quickly beyond its buildings. Just thinking about the materiality of an artistic work, an architectural work, we're talking about loads of information about geometry, about symbolism, about views, affordances, so on and so forth. So we immediately start moving beyond brute materiality. When you think about architecture, of course, often as well, you're not talking about buildings, but you're talking about representations of ideas for works. So plans, sketches, elevations, and these representations could be about represent different aspects of a work, of an architectural work, to represent different phases, represent different stages in the evolution of creating that architectural work. And then finally, you might also start thinking about the fact that architecture and art more generally, that we're not just talking about things nor concepts, but we're talking about events, and events that come and go. So this particular church was built with this technique of building this teepee and organizing the concrete around it and then burning it out. And that's also part of the information around the architecture, around the art, that it's interesting to try to think of how to represent ontologically. Another reason to take up architectural information as a representative set within the general artistic world is that architects are early adopters and heavily engaged in technological tools. So there's a lot to work with already. There's architects, like other professionals, will use different tools like spreadsheets and databases for organizing their knowledge, but also use a variety of graphical formats for representing their ideas, a number of common tools like CAD and so on and so forth. And so there's a lot of data to work with and a mishmash of metadata, and not a lot of focus on the meta question of knowledge organization. So that led us down the path of this idea of modeling architectural and eventually artistic creative process. So we argue that there's a real opportunity with a profession like architecture, which is so documentation oriented, but not so focused on the organization of the documentation, to really think through the basic data structures again through this ontological and conceptual modeling process, and try to think through data structures that would provide the level of accuracy and yet flexibility and adaptation to purpose, which would allow to the expression of these complex different objects and relationships that we would like to be able to record and connect in an information system about architecture and art. So this is just take a step back, look at a previous work where we talked about what is architecture, and pointed to the fact that in general you can talk about it as a thing, as a built work. You can think about it as an intellectual object, as we talked about plans, and we can talk about it as an activity. When you start thinking about it in that framework, and you're coming at it from the CIDOC CRM school of modeling, then your mind starts to go towards the work that's been done with the IFLA group in formulating FRBROO, which talks about processes of creation in a general sense, and talks about the basic activities that lead from an activity into materialization, into specific concepts, and then into different physical carriers. So that was the starting off point that we moved from. So adopting the modeling pattern from FRBROO that talks about this notion of an expression creation where there's an event of creation by an artist, by an architect, that goes from an idea, an abstract idea, and expresses it into a particular intellectual formulation, whether that be text or drawing or whatever, and expressed onto a particular unique carrier. And when you adopt that sort of thinking, then you can start really thinking about I mean, it already provides a powerful tool to try to start to think about how you would connect together the different objects and different processes and different ideas that come about in a creative process. And what we set about doing was thinking about, well, that's very abstract, and we want to bring it down closer to the field of architectural work and create classes and relationships that are consistent with identifiable phases of the work of creation. So it's not just there is an idea and then something is written down and the idea is expressed, but obviously when you talk about architecture, you're talking about teams of individuals working together at different steps to conceive of a project, to conceive of how to execute it, and to eventually potentially build it. So it's actually a large piece of research, but giving the overview, what we identified were three key phases: programmation, leading to the generation of some sort of architectural program. So that's, and then that establishes a set of parameters within which design should occur. Then there's a notion of design, which leads to expression of architectural models, which can be sketches or physical models, etc., which attempt to meet the architectural program parameters. And then these can be translated, have to be translated again as intellectual objects into construction plans, which can then finally be used to execute actual construction should a project come to fruition. So the whole essence of this research was to try to identify these large-scale blocks of the creative process and the basic kinds of objects that are created. And so here, this diagram is just to show that we have this notion of an general notion of an architectural formulation, which generalizes over these three types of intellectual objects, which we argue are created during the process. So and each of them is both an individual creative expression following FRBR, but also a designer procedure or activity plan in the CIDOC CRM sense of a projection of something to happen in the future, and specialized towards either creating constraints, trying to express constraints, or trying to use models to plan actual physical construction processes. Because of the constraint of time, I'm only going to point to one of these processes in a bit of detail and show this example of programmation. So the notion of programmation is the event within the overall creative processes workflow, let's say, in which the overall work of the idea of the requirements for a project are worked out by a team and result in the creation of, after multiple potential iterations, an architectural program. And then, so I give an example of this, making a sort of nod to our hosts. There, you could give an example of the competition to build the Palais des Nations. So there was a work to design the intellectual program that was desired in order to have a competition to try to get proposals of models to have a new building which would express this notion of the Palais des Nations. I think I still have 3 minutes. So I mean, this slide will look complicated, but it starts to point towards the fact that you can start to do interesting things in terms of thinking about what has happened, what was called for and what actually happened. So using some modeling work from the CRM SIG, we came up with this idea of potential future events, potential future objects, and properties that talk about what was stipulated to happen. What time something would happen, how long it would take, what kind of thing it should produce. And so when you start getting those sorts of complicated structures, then you can start to talk about the things that are really interesting in architectural research, like talking about the fact that a program was brought up that caused a number of different models to be proposed, of which only some were selected, and some of which may or may not have borne the properties that were demanded from in the original program. So we can talk about the fact that there are 370 projects that were submitted to try to fulfill the program that was defined in the Palais competition, and which had certain constraints, like it should be made by a member of the League of Nations, and it should have a construction limit or budget limit of 13 million francs. So I don't want to monopolize your time, so I'll move quickly on to my last slides. I opened with this sort of question of what is an architectural object, and I talked about the processes, and what is finally an architectural artistic object. And obviously, that's a huge philosophical question. But through the practice of doing this modeling with colleagues at the Swiss Art Research Infrastructure, we really alighted on the fact that in the end, the central object that we used to bind all of the creative process together, we called the oeuvre. And the oeuvre is what is often called project in architectural work, but is the moment of wanting to conceive an architectural object by a client group and an executing group. And you can conceive of that as an event which begins a process which can go through many iterations of programmation and design and construction planning and eventual evolution, and is able finally to integrate a lot of the information that I mentioned at the start, is part of the multifaceted notion of what architecture or art is. So I'll skip over that and finish on this last two slides. So our example was architecture, and we worked with data from colleagues at SADI, and things worked well. But we moved quickly towards the idea that we should expand it towards art in general, because there are a lot of questions where, and sort of bleeding edge questions of documentation of, well, how can you record art that doesn't exist, or the kinds of art proposed by Saul Lewitt, where what is offered is an instruction, and what can be, and this can be produced by anybody mechanically following the instruction. And we would argue, and of course we need more time to make the argument, that using these different phases of creative process, you can document these different levels and interpretations of what the artistic and architectural object is. And so we ended up with an ontology of more or less 19 classes and 25 relations. And it's not presently online, but we're working on publishing it. And so we will, and then you'll have access to it. Thank you for your time. I hope I was clear.